In the autumn of 1867, when the South lay broken beneath the weight of its own sins, a Union soldier named Jacob Mercer arrived in the ruins of what had once been called Thornwood County, Alabama. The war had ended, but its ghosts lingered in every crumbling pillar, every field gone fallow with weeds and memory. Mercer's task was mundane, bureaucratic even, to catalog the remains of Confederate properties, to inventory what the federal government might reclaim from the wreckage of a fallen nation. But what he discovered in that forsaken place would haunt him until his final breath and long after. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please subscribe and like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The old courthouse stood at the center of town like a rotting tooth, its white columns stained with decades of weather and guilt. This was where they had held the auctions, where human beings were paraded and priced like livestock, their worth measured in the cold arithmetic of flesh and profit. The building had been abandoned for 2 years, its doors hanging loose on rusted hinges, its windows shattered by stones thrown by those who wished to forget what had transpired within. But memory, Mercer would learn, is not so easily destroyed. He entered on a Tuesday morning, the 14th of October, when the mist clung to the ground like a burial shroud. The air inside was thick with decay, sweet with rot and ancient wood pulp. Dust motes drifted in shafts of gray light that penetrated through holes in the roof, and everywhere the smell of mildew crept into his nostrils, his lungs, as if the building itself were breathing corruption. The auction block still stood in the main hall, a raised platform of darkened wood, worn smooth by countless feet, countless bodies displayed and sold. Mercer approached it slowly, his boots echoing in the emptiness, and felt a coldness settle over him that had nothing to do with the October chill. He began his cataloging in the offices behind the main hall, sifting through water-damaged papers and moldering account books. Most were illegible, the ink bleeding into meaningless stains, but he worked methodically, driven by a soldier's discipline and a growing, inexplicable unease. It was in the auctioneer's private chamber, a cramped room with a single narrow window, that he found the hollowed beam. The wood had split along its length, revealing a cavity that appeared deliberately carved. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had only partially preserved its contents, was a ledger bound in cracked leather. Mercer extracted it carefully, his fingers trembling with a premonition he could not name. The pages were stiff with moisture and age, many entries smeared beyond recognition, but one caught his eye immediately, written in a hand so precise it seemed to cut into the paper itself. 27 cents, E.W. Woom claimed. The words sent a chill through Mercer's spine that felt almost physical, as though icy fingers had traced the vertebrae one by one. He turned the pages with increasing dread, finding scattered references to a woman listed only as property number 412, a pregnant female of approximately 22 years, sold to one Thomas Hale on the 9th of March, 1863. The price was confirmed, 27 cents, an amount so grotesquely small it defied comprehension. A human life, 2 human lives for less than the cost of a pound of coffee. But it was the notation beneath that stopped his breath entirely. In the same meticulous hand, someone had written, "He said the child would know its true master." Mercer's hand shook as he read those words again and again, trying to extract meaning from their sinister simplicity. Who had said this? The seller? The buyer? What did it mean for a child not yet born to know its master? The implications writhed in his mind like maggots in spoiled meat. Tucked between the pages, he found a small object wrapped in deteriorating silk. When he unfolded the cloth, a locket fell into his palm, rusted but still intact, its clasp corroded shut. He worked at it with his knife for several minutes before it sprang open, revealing a lock of hair so fine and pale it seemed almost translucent in the dim light. A child's hair. An infant's, perhaps. The color was unusual, a silvery blonde that appeared almost gray, the shade of smoke or ash or something long dead. As Mercer stood in that cramped room, holding the locket and the ledger, he became aware of a sound he had not noticed before, a faint creaking, rhythmic and patient, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It was the sound of wood under strain, of old joints protesting, but in the silence it took on a quality almost human, almost deliberate, like footsteps, like pacing. He descended to the courthouse cellar with a lamp that cast wild shadows on the moisture-slicked walls. The stairs were treacherous, several boards missing entirely, forcing him to leap across gaps of perfect darkness. The smell grew worse as he went down, not just mildew now, but something organic, something that whispered of rot and forgotten things sealed away from light and air. The cellar was a maze of cramped passages and storage rooms, their purposes long since obscured. Mercer moved through them methodically, his lamp held high, until he reached a locked door at the end of a particularly narrow corridor. The lock was substantial, designed to protect something valuable, but it had succumbed to rust and moisture. A single hard pull tore it free. The room beyond was small and windowless, the air so stale it made him cough. In the center sat a trunk, iron-bound and sealed, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust that showed no footprints, no disturbance. Yet Mercer had the uncanny sensation that he was expected, that this discovery had been arranged, that he was following a script, written long before his arrival. The trunk's lock broke easily. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet, he found 3 objects that would become the foundation of his obsession. The first was a rattle, carved from bone with disturbing skill. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the surface polished smooth and etched with patterns that suggested language, though Mercer could identify no alphabet he knew. When he shook it gently, the sound it produced was not the cheerful clatter of wooden beads, but something softer, more organic, like seeds or teeth rattling in a hollow skull. The second was a journal, its leather cover stained and warped, but its pages miraculously preserved. The handwriting was feminine, hurried, each entry dated but many left incomplete. The name inscribed on the first page read, Esther Greaves, midwife. Mercer's hands trembled as he turned to the first entry, dated March 10th, 1863, one day after the auction. Called to Hale Farm. Woman arrived yesterday from auction, condition advanced. She is terrified, will not speak her name. Refers to previous master only as he or him. When I examined her, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "The child is marked. The child knows its father." I asked what she meant, but she would say no more, only wept silently, tears streaming without sound or shudder, as though grief itself had been refined to its purest, most terrible essence. The third object was a piece of cloth, once white but now yellowed and stained with substances Mercer preferred not to identify. Embroidered in the corner, in thread that had maintained its crimson brightness despite the years, were 2 letters. E. W. Mercer sat back on his heels, his mind racing to connect these fragments into coherent narrative. A pregnant woman sold for 27 cents. A child claimed before its birth. A midwife who recorded her fear, and those initials, E.W., repeated in the ledger and stitched into cloth. Who was E.W.? What had he done to inspire such terror that even writing his full name seemed dangerous? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a sound drifted down from somewhere above, soft, almost musical, utterly out of place in this chamber of decay. It was the sound of an infant cooing, that wordless vocalization of contentment that babies make in their mother's arms. But there were no babies here, no mothers, No life at all beyond the rats and the rot. Mercer climbed the stairs with controlled haste, his rational mind insisting it was merely the wind, the settling of old wood, the acoustics of empty rooms playing tricks. But his body knew better. His body understood that he had opened something that should have remained sealed, that by disturbing these objects he had sent ripples across the surface of the past, and those ripples were now returning to him like waves against a drowning man's face. He emerged into the fading light of afternoon, gasping as though he had been underwater. The courthouse loomed behind him, its windows like empty eye sockets, its doors hanging open like a slack jaw, and as he stood there, clutching the trunk's contents to his chest, he heard it again, that soft cooing drifting from within, impossible and undeniable. That night, in his rented room above the general store, Mercer spread his findings across the narrow bed and began to read Esther Greaves's journal in earnest. What he found there would transform his investigation from bureaucratic duty into desperate quest, would drag him down into depths of human cruelty he had not imagined possible, even after 4 years of witnessing war's atrocities. Because what Esther Greaves had recorded was not merely the story of a woman and her unborn child. It was the chronicle of an abomination, a crime so profound it had left a wound in the fabric of reality itself. And that wound, Mercer was beginning to understand, had never healed. It was still bleeding. The road to Thomas Hale's farm cut through land that seemed to remember suffering, where even the trees grew twisted and the earth refused to nurture anything but thorns and bitter weeds. Mercer made the journey on horseback, the midwife's journal tucked inside his coat like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The sky above was the color of old bruises, purple and yellow and sick, and the wind carried a smell like turned earth and something sweeter, something that made his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The farmhouse appeared through the morning mist, like a specter, its outline uncertain, its substance questionable. It had been abandoned for more than 2 years, according to county records, but abandonment was too gentle a word for what had happened here. The structure seemed violated somehow, as though violence had been done not to its occupants, but to the building itself, to the very idea of shelter and home. Mercer dismounted and approached slowly, his boots crunching on gravel mixed with fragments of something pale that he chose not to examine too closely. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze with a rhythmic creaking that reminded him uncomfortably of the sounds in the courthouse cellar. He paused at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to ride away from this place and never return. But he had read too much in Esther Greaves's journal. He had seen too many hints of the horror that had unfolded here. He had to know. The interior was a study in decay and madness. The furniture remained, but it had been arranged in ways that defied both function and logic. Chairs stacked in corners, tables overturned and positioned like barricades, a rocking chair suspended by ropes from the ceiling beams, as though someone had been trying to keep it from touching the floor. The walls bore marks that Mercer initially took for water stains or mold, but as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized they were deliberate, carved into the wood with something sharp and, applied with obsessive repetition, tally marks, hundreds of them, thousands. They covered every wall, every surface, climbing up to the ceiling and descending to the baseboards in neat rows that spoke of methodical, patient counting. Mercer moved through the rooms, following the trail of marks, trying to understand their purpose. In the kitchen they seemed to begin, starting in a corner and spreading outward like an infection. In the main room they reached their greatest density, so tightly packed that the wood beneath was barely visible. But it was in the bedroom that he found their terminus. The marks ended abruptly at a final cluster, circled repeatedly until the wood had been worn through to splinters. Mercer counted them carefully, his lips moving silently. 241. 241 days of counting. 241 days of what? Of waiting, of endurance, of descent into whatever madness had driven Thomas Hale to abandon this place. Beneath the window, carved in letters larger than the rest, was a single sentence. "She hears him calling." A sound from below made Mercer freeze, a soft scraping, deliberate and patient. He descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the other gripping the knife at his belt. The basement entrance was concealed behind what had once been a pantry, its door so cleverly disguised he might have missed it entirely, if not for the scraping sound that seemed to be coming from below. The stairs descended into absolute darkness, a blackness so complete his lamp seemed to die rather than illuminate. Mercer forced himself down step by step, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. The smell here was overwhelming, earth and decay, and something metallic that coated his tongue with every breath. The basement was not a basement at all, but a root cellar, its walls lined with empty shelves and hooks that had once held cured meat or drying herbs. Now they held nothing but shadows and the memory of what had transpired here. The floor was packed earth, cold and damp, and in the center was a disturbed patch where the soil had been recently turned. Not recently, Mercer corrected himself, looking closer. Years ago. But in this sealed chamber where air and light never penetrated, the evidence remained fresh, preserved like a specimen in a jar. He began to dig with his hands, driven by a compulsion he could not name, his fingers clawing through the loose earth with increasing desperation. 3 feet down, he struck something that was neither stone nor root. He brushed away the surrounding soil carefully, revealing fabric first, rotted cotton, the remains of a dress perhaps, and then, horrifyingly, bone. 2 skeletons lay in the shallow grave, one large and one heartbreakingly small. They were positioned strangely, the larger curled protectively around the smaller, arms wrapped around the tiny form in an embrace that death had not broken. Mercer sat back on his heels, his throat tight, his eyes burning with tears he had not shed since childhood. This was Dinah, this was her child, this was where their story had ended, buried in darkness, sealed away from the world, as though their very existence had been a crime too terrible to acknowledge. But what had killed them? There were no signs of violence on the bones, no fractures or trauma that he could see. They had died together, mother and infant, in this cold earth, but how? And why had Thomas Hale buried them here in secret in darkness? The answer came as Mercer's lamp swung across the cellar wall, illuminating words carved deep into the stone with what must have been hours of desperate effort. Thomas Hale's confession, left for no one and everyone, a testament to the horror he had witnessed and his own complicity in its unfolding. March 10th, 1863. I bought her to save her. 27 cents was all I had after the tax collectors came. I thought it was mercy. I thought I was doing God's work. But mercy can be its own damnation when extended by the wrong hands, at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. She would not speak her name, would not meet my eyes. When my wife tried to help her to the bedroom, she flinched as though expecting a blow. That night, I heard her weeping through the walls, a sound so quiet and so profound it seemed to come not from her throat, but from the very air itself, as though the world itself was grieving for what had been done to her. The midwife came the next day, Mrs. Greaves, a woman of experience and discretion. She examined the woman in the back room while I waited in the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could not hold my coffee cup. When she emerged, her face was pale, her lips pressed thin. She said the woman was healthy, that the child would come within weeks, but that something was wrong in ways she could not articulate. Something about the woman's fear, its quality and intensity, suggested not merely past trauma, but present danger. That night, he came. Mercer's hands trembled as he read those words. He came. Not a name, not an identification, just the pronoun weighted with such significance it needed no further elaboration. I heard the horse first, then the knock at my door. Not a request, but a demand, fist on wood, patient and terrible in its confidence. My wife clutched my arm, whispered, "We should not answer, but I am a coward. I have always been a coward." I opened the door. He stood on my threshold like judgment itself. Elias Wren. I knew him by reputation, of course. Everyone in Thornwood County knew Elias Wren. He had been wealthy once, before the war destroyed the cotton trade and the Confederacy crumbled, but wealth had been merely the visible manifestation of what he truly possessed. Power. Power over land, power over property, power over human beings whom he regarded not as people, but as extensions of his will, as living tools to be used and discarded according to his pleasure. He did not ask to enter. He simply stepped past me into my home as though ownership extended beyond his own property to encompass all the world and everything in it. He looked around my poor kitchen with undisguised contempt, then fixed his gaze upon me with eyes the color of dirty ice. "I have come for what is mine," he said. His voice was cultured, educated, the voice of a man who read philosophy and attended church and considered himself the pinnacle of civilization. It made the words themselves more obscene. This veneer of gentility stretched over an abyss of absolute moral corruption. I told him I had purchased the woman legally at auction. I showed him the bill of sale, though my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the paper. He glanced at it with amusement, as one might regard a child's drawing. 27 cents, he said, and smiled. A price paid to satisfy the letter of the law, while violating its spirit entirely. But you misunderstand, Mr. Hale. I did not come for the woman. I came for the child. The child is mine. The child will always be mine. Blood speaks to blood, you see. Legacy recognizes legacy. I asked him to leave. I told him the woman and her unborn child were under my protection now, that he had no claim to either. His smile widened, revealing teeth too white, too perfect, like tombstones in a carefully tended graveyard. "Protection," he repeated, tasting the word. "You think you protect her by bringing her here? You think 27 cents purchases safety? Mr. Hale, you have not saved her. You have merely delayed the inevitable. The child knows its father. When it is born, it will call to me, and I will answer. This is the nature of property. This is the logic of ownership. It transcends law. It transcends morality. It transcends even death itself." He left then, mounting his horse with the easy grace of a man who has never doubted his right to take what he wants. But at the gate he turned back, and in the moonlight his face seemed to shift, to become not quite human, not quite anything I could name. "Count the days, Mr. Hale," he called. 241 until the child is born. I will return then to claim what is mine." How did he know? How could he know with such precision the date of a birth not yet occurred? I have asked myself this question 10,000 times. I have no answer. I have only the terrible certainty that he was correct. My wife left me 3 weeks later. She said she could not stay in this house, that something was wrong with it, that she heard voices in the walls and saw shadows moving in rooms that should be empty. She said the woman, Dinah, she had finally told us her name was Dinah, frightened her, not because of anything she did, but because of what she was, a vessel for something that should not exist, a carrier of corruption that would poison everything it touched. I wanted to leave too. God help me, I wanted to run as far and as fast as my legs would carry me, but I had bought her. I had taken responsibility, and some part of me, the part that still believed in righteousness, despite all evidence to the contrary, insisted that I could protect her, that I could save them both. I was wrong. Mercer lowered the lamp, his eyes burning from strain and emotion. The rest of the confession continued across the walls, in increasingly cramped, increasingly frantic handwriting, the letters growing smaller and smaller as Thomas Hale descended into the nightmare that would ultimately consume him. But Mercer had read enough for now. He understood the shape of what had happened here, if not yet its full dimensions. He climbed back to the main floor and searched the rest of the house with renewed purpose. In what had been Hale's bedroom, he found a loose floorboard, and beneath it a tin box containing letters, dozens of them, written but never sent, addressed to ministers and doctors and anyone Hale thought might offer help or understanding. One letter stood out, dated July 14th, 1863, 4 months after Dinah's arrival. Mercer carried it to the window where the light was better and read with mounting dread. The child was born 3 days ago. Dinah's labor was long and difficult. Mrs. Greaves stayed throughout, though I could see her fear growing with each passing hour. When the child finally emerged, it did not cry. "This is not unusual," Mrs. Greaves assured me. "Sometimes infants need encouragement to take their first breath." But this child was breathing. I could see its small chest rising and falling. It simply chose not to cry. And its eyes, dear God in heaven, its eyes. They were open from the first moment, and they were the color of dirty ice, the exact shade of Elias Wren's eyes, though the child had never seen its father, could not possibly know what color eyes to inherit through any natural means. Dinah saw those eyes and began to scream, not the scream of pain or exhaustion, but of pure terror, the sound of a soul confronting something it recognizes as its own damnation. Mrs. Greaves tried to place the child in her arms, but Dinah recoiled, pressing herself against the headboard, her hands raised as though to ward off a demon. "Take it away," she begged. "Please take it away. He is in it. He looks at me through it. Take it away before it speaks." But the child did not speak. It only watched with those terrible ice-colored eyes, watched and breathed, and made no sound at all. That night I heard him for the first time, Elias Wren, not at my door, but in the walls themselves, his voice traveling through wood and plaster, as though the house had become an instrument designed solely to transmit his words. "The child knows me," his voice whispered. "The child calls to me. You cannot keep what is mine, Mr. Hale. Mercy was your sin. Compassion was your mistake. You should have let her die on the auction block. Now you will watch as I take what was always mine to claim." I ran to Dinah's room. She sat upright in bed, the child in her arms now, pressed against her chest, not with love, but with the desperate grip of someone drowning and clinging to debris. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the wall where shadows moved in patterns that defied the lamplight's logic. "He is here," she whispered. "He has always been here. The child is the door through which he enters. I should have killed myself before it was born. I should have done what he could not prevent, but I was too weak, too afraid, and now it is too late. Now we all pay the price of my cowardice." The child turned its head. I swear before God, it turned its head at 3 days old and looked at me with eyes that held not innocence, but calculation, not helplessness, but power. And in that moment, I understood what Elias Wren had done. I understood the true nature of his ownership and the depth of his depravity. He had made the child his vessel. Through violation and will and some darker power I dare not name, he had bound himself to the infant before its birth, had made it not merely his offspring, but his extension, his anchor to a life and a property he refused to relinquish. The child was not a person. The child was a door, and through that door Elias Wren could walk whenever he chose. I took them to the root cellar that night. I told Dinah it was for safety, for protection, that Wren could not reach them there. She knew I was lying. She went anyway because the only thing worse than dying was living with what her child had become. I brought them food and water. I stayed with them as much as I could bear. But the cellar was cold, and the child still did not cry, only watched with those terrible eyes, and I could feel Wren's presence growing stronger with each passing day, his voice in the walls becoming clearer, his shadow in the corners becoming more distinct. On the seventh day, I went down to find them both dead. No violence, no struggle. They lay together as though sleeping, Dinah's arms still wrapped around the child, but both cold, both still, both gone to wherever souls flee when torment becomes unbearable, or so I thought. Because that night I heard the child again, its soft cooing, that wordless infant sound, drifting from the cellar where two bodies lay buried in hastily turned earth. I heard it night after night, week after week, until I could not distinguish between sleeping and waking, between memory and madness. I burned what I could. I carved my days on the walls to prove to myself that time still passed, that I still existed in the realm of the living. But the counting became its own obsession, and when I reached 241, the exact number Wren had spoken on that first terrible night, I knew I could not stay. I knew that some promises transcend death, some ownership extends beyond the grave, and some sins are too profound to be forgiven or forgotten. I am leaving this place. I am abandoning this house to whatever haunts it. Let the county take it. Let the earth reclaim it. Let it rot until no stone stands upon another and no memory remains of what transpired within these walls. But I fear it will not be enough. I fear that what Elias Wren created here has taken root in ways that transcend physical space, that the horror will linger long after the wood has crumbled and the bones have turned to dust. I fear that by trying to show mercy, I have only prolonged suffering, that by paying 27 cents to save 2 lives, I condemned 3 souls, hers, the child's, and my own, to a damnation more complete than any fire or torment imagined by preachers in their Sunday sermons. God forgive me. I tried. The letter ended there, unsigned, unsent, testimony to nothing and no one. Mercer folded it carefully and returned it to the tin box. His hands were steady now, his mind clear despite the horrors he had read. He was a soldier. He had seen men die in every conceivable way. He had walked through fields where the dead lay so thick you could not step without treading on someone's brother, someone's son, someone's father. He had witnessed the depths of what human beings could do to one another in the name of cause and country and conviction. But this was different. This was not the violence of war or the cruelty of necessity. This was something colder, more calculated, more profoundly wrong. Elias Wren had not killed these people. He had corrupted them. He had poisoned the very idea of mercy and compassion until Thomas Hale's attempts at goodness became instruments of torment. And somehow, impossibly, his influence had not died with his body, because Elias Wren was dead. Mercer had confirmed this at the county courthouse before making this journey. Elias Wren had died in January of 1863, 2 months before the auction where Dinah was sold, 2 months before Thomas Hale paid 27 cents to purchase her. Whatever had come to Hale's door on that night in March had not been a living man but something else, something that wore Elias Wren's face and spoke with his voice and claimed ownership that extended beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. As Mercer stood in the empty farmhouse, holding the last confession of Thomas Hale, he heard it again, that soft, impossible sound. An infant's coo, patient and persistent, coming from the cellar below. He did not go down to investigate. He had seen enough. He had learned enough. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some truths, once known, cannot be unknown. He left the farmhouse as the sun was setting, mounted his horse, and rode back toward town without looking back. But he carried with him the knowledge of what had transpired in that place, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and forever. Mercer spent the next 3 weeks searching for Elias Wren's history, piecing together the life and philosophy of a man who had found a way to transgress even the absolute boundary of death. What he discovered was not a monster in the conventional sense, not a creature of impulse or passion or even madness. Elias Wren had been something far more terrifying, a man of principle, a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his convictions and possessed the intelligence and will to pursue them to their ultimate, horrifying conclusions. Wren had been born in 1822 to a wealthy Virginia family, educated at the finest universities, exposed to the great philosophical and theological debates of his age. He had read Aristotle and Aquinas, Locke and Hume, and from this education he had distilled a worldview of perfect, poisonous clarity. He believed that hierarchy was not merely a social construction, but a natural law, as immutable as gravity, as fundamental as mathematics. And within this hierarchy, he had positioned himself at the apex, justified by breeding and intelligence and divine favor to rule over those he considered lesser beings. Slavery to Elias Wren was not an economic necessity or a regrettable compromise. It was the correct and proper ordering of the universe, the visible manifestation of invisible truth. And like any truth-seeker, any philosopher pursuing logic to its ultimate end, he could not accept limitations or half-measures. If ownership was justified, and he believed it was, then ownership must be absolute. It must extend not merely to labor and body, but to soul and progeny, to every aspect of existence and every moment of time. Mercer found this philosophy articulated in a journal he discovered among Wren's effects, which had been stored in the county archives after his death. The journal was not a confession, but a manifesto, pages and pages of careful reasoning, of arguments constructed with the precision of a lawyer and the certainty of a prophet. The error of my contemporaries, Wren had written in 1858, is that they view property as a temporary arrangement, subject to sale and transfer and ultimate dissolution. But property, properly understood, is an expression of natural order, and natural order is eternal. When I acquire a human being, I do not merely purchase their labor for a season. I assume dominion over their essence. This dominion cannot be sold or transferred because it is not a transaction but a revelation, the recognition of what has always been true. And if dominion extends to the individual, it must necessarily extend to their progeny. The child of my property is my property, not by purchase but by nature. The blood that flows in their veins carries my ownership like a signature, like a brand that cannot be removed or obscured. This is not cruelty, this is not injustice, this is simply the acknowledgement of reality. The implications troubled even Wren's fellow slaveholders, who saw in his philosophy something that made them uncomfortable despite, or perhaps because of, their own participation in the institution. There were rumors that he conducted experiments, that he attempted to breed not merely for physical traits but for psychological ones, that he believed ownership could be made hereditary not through law, but through some more fundamental, more terrible mechanism. And then there was Dinah. Mercer found references to her in a plantation record book dated 1861 to 1862. She had been purchased by Wren at age 19, bought from an estate sale after her previous owner's death. The entry describing her was clinical, detached, noting her health and appearance and suitability for domestic work. But in the margins, in Wren's hand, was a single notation that made Mercer's blood run cold. Selected for breeding program. Psychological compliance high. Will serve as ideal subject for inheritance experiments. What followed in the subsequent months was documented with the same clinical detachment, a scientist recording observations of an experiment in progress. Wren noted dates, behaviors, physical changes. He recorded Dinah's responses to various conditions, her reactions to his presence, the measurable ways in which her will bent to his own. And when she became pregnant, though the journal never explicitly stated this was Wren's intention, the timing and his subsequent notes made it clear. He began a new series of entries under the heading Observations on Prenatal Claim Establishment. "The child will know me," he wrote. "This is not metaphor or hope, but certainty. I have spoken to it each night while it grows in her womb. I have placed my hands on her belly and felt it move in response to my voice. I have established ownership not through law, but through bond, through the creation of a connection that transcends physical separation. When the child is born, it will carry my will within it as surely as it carries my blood. It will be mine in ways that no court can adjudicate and no force can sever. This is the true meaning of property. This is the perfection of dominion. Not merely to own the body, but to own the soul, to write oneself so deeply into another being that the distinction between owner and owned becomes meaningless. The child will be me, and I will be the child. And through this union I will prove that ownership is not a legal fiction, but an existential truth." Mercer's hands trembled as he read these passages. Here was the answer to the question that had haunted him since discovering the cellar at Thomas Hale's farm. Elias Wren had not merely raped Dinah, he had attempted to colonize her unborn child's identity, to make it an extension of himself through some combination of psychological manipulation and pure, focused will, and somehow, impossibly, he had succeeded. But there was more. As Mercer continued through the journal, he found entries dated after Wren's death, or rather, entries written as though death were merely an inconvenience, a temporary obstacle to be overcome through sufficient determination. January 14th, 1863. "I am dying. The consumption has spread to both lungs. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps days. My body fails, but my will remains absolute. I have invested too much in this experiment to allow physical dissolution to end it. The child is my legacy, my proof, my immortality. If consciousness is merely will given form, then will sufficiently strong can persist beyond the death of its original vessel. The child will be my anchor. Through it I will continue. This is not madness or desperation. This is logic pursued to its necessary conclusion. If ownership is eternal, then the owner must also be eternal. If property transcends death, and it must, for inheritance proves this principle, then the proprietor must also transcend. I will not die. I will merely relocate. The woman does not yet know I am dying. She must not know. If she believes I am dying, she will hope for freedom, and hope will break the bond I have carefully constructed. She must believe I am eternal. She must fear me beyond death. Only then will the child remain open to me. Only then will my passage through that doorway be possible. January 28, 1863. Today I died. Or rather, today Elias Wren's body ceased functioning. But I remain. I can feel the child, a warmth in the darkness, a light toward which I move. The woman has been sold. I watched from somewhere outside myself as they put her on the auction block, as they priced her like spoiled goods, as some pathetic farmer paid his 27 cents, thinking he performed an act of mercy. He does not understand. Mercy is irrelevant. The child is mine. Geography cannot separate us. Poverty cannot protect her. Death itself cannot break what I have forged. I will go to them when the time is right. I will remind them that ownership is eternal, and when the child is born, I will prove that consciousness is not bound by flesh, that will sufficiently absolute can inhabit any vessel prepared to receive it. This is not possession. This is not haunting. This is inheritance in its truest sense, the passing of self from one generation to another, unbroken and complete. The journal ended there, the final entry dated 2 days after Wren's physical death, written in a hand identical to his earlier entries. Either Elias Wren had prepared these passages before dying, anticipating what he would think and feel beyond death with disturbing accuracy, or, and this was what terrified Mercer most, he had somehow found a way to continue writing after his body lay cold in the ground. Mercer closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time. Outside the courthouse window, Thornwood County went about its business, people moving through the streets, rebuilding their lives after the war's devastation, trying to forget the horrors of the past and focus on whatever future might be possible. But Mercer could not forget. He could not dismiss what he had learned as superstition or coincidence, or the ravings of a diseased mind, because there were too many correspondences, too many impossible accuracies. Thomas Hale had described Elias Wren's visit 2 months after Wren's documented death. The child had been born with Wren's eyes, a genetic impossibility unless Wren was indeed the father, and Dinah's terror, her absolute conviction that her child had become a vessel for its father's will, suggested she had experienced something real, something beyond her ability to rationalize or dismiss. What Wren had attempted was nothing less than the ultimate expression of ownership, not merely to possess another person's body or labor, but to possess their very essence, to inhabit their offspring, to continue existing through them in a way that made death irrelevant. And the evidence suggested he had succeeded, at least partially. Something of Elias Wren had persisted beyond his physical death. Something had gone to Thomas Hale's farm and claimed what it considered rightfully owned. But had it achieved its ultimate goal? Had Wren actually transferred his consciousness into the infant, or had he merely created a psychological horror that drove Dinah and her child to their deaths? The distinction mattered. If Wren had failed, if Dinah and the infant had died and ended the experiment, then the horror was finite, contained, a tragedy of the past that could be mourned and eventually forgotten. But if he had succeeded? Mercer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the courthouse floor. He needed to know. He needed to understand the end of this story, not merely for his report, but for his own peace of mind, for his ability to sleep at night without hearing that soft cooing sound that had begun to infiltrate his dreams. He returned to Thomas Hale's farm as the sun was setting, the sky bleeding orange and red like a wound across the horizon. The farmhouse seemed to watch his approach with malevolent patience, as though it had been expecting him, as though his return had always been inevitable. He went directly to the root cellar, his lamp casting wild shadows on the earthen walls. The grave he had partially excavated still gaped open, the 2 skeletons visible in the lamplight, their embrace eternal and terrible. But this time Mercer noticed something he had missed before, a third presence in the grave, so small he had initially thought it merely debris or root matter. A second infant skeleton positioned between Dinah and the first child, but separate, distinct. Its bones were arranged differently, more carefully, and around its tiny skull someone had placed a wreath woven from dried flowers that had somehow maintained their shape, despite the years underground. 2 infants, Dinah had given birth to twins. The realization hit Mercer like a physical blow. All this time he had assumed there was one child, Wren's vessel, Wren's anchor, but there had been 2, and if there were 2... He returned to the cellar wall where Thomas Hale's confession was carved and searched frantically for any mention of twins, any indication that Hale had known, but there was nothing. The confession spoke only of the child, singular, never plural, which meant one of 2 possibilities. Either Dinah had concealed the second birth from Hale, had somehow delivered twins but shown him only one, or the second infant had been born after the first's death, a biological impossibility that suggested something far more disturbing than Mercer wanted to consider. He climbed back to the main floor and searched the house more thoroughly, looking for anything he might have missed, any clue that might explain this final mystery. In a corner of what had been the kitchen, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he found a small bundle wrapped in the same type of rotting cloth as the objects in the courthouse cellar. Inside was a note in a feminine hand, not Esther Greaves's steady script, but something more frantic, more desperate. "My name is Dinah. I write this so someone will know what happened here, so the world will understand that we tried to fight, that we did not surrender willingly to the darkness that claimed us. The child was born on the 17th of July, the first child, the one Thomas Hale saw, the one with its father's eyes. It did not cry. It only watched with a patience no infant should possess, a calculation that made my blood run cold. I knew immediately what it was. I could feel Elias within it, looking out at me through those ice-colored eyes, wearing my baby's face like a mask. But there was a second child, born an hour after the first, so small and weak I feared it would not survive its first breath. This one cried. This one had my eyes, dark and human. This one was mine alone, untouched by its father's corruption. I named it Mercy because mercy was what Thomas Hale had shown me, and mercy was what I hoped might save us all. I hid Mercy from Thomas. I could not trust him, could not trust anyone, with the knowledge that one child carried Elias's will while the other remained free. If Elias knew there were two, if he understood that his vessel had a twin, he would claim them both. He would corrupt them both. I could not allow it. For 7 days I kept both children in the cellar, nursing them in darkness, singing to Mercy while its sibling watched with eyes that never blinked, never softened, never showed anything resembling love or need or humanity. And each night Elias came, not in body but in presence, his voice filling the cellar, his shadow moving across the walls. "Give me what is mine," he commanded. "Give me the vessel I have prepared." I tried to resist. I tried to keep both children hidden, to deny him access to either. But on the 7th night, Mercy became ill. The cold and damp and my own failing milk were killing it slowly. I could hear it struggling to breathe, feel its small body growing weaker in my arms, and Elias knew. He sensed my desperation, my weakness, my love. He made me an offer. "Give me the vessel, and I will spare the other. Give me what I have claimed, and the child you call Mercy will live. Refuse, and I will take them both. I will corrupt them both. I will make them both extensions of my will, and you will watch as every trace of your hope dies behind their eyes." What choice did I have? What choice does any mother have when offered such a devil's bargain? I gave him the first child. I placed it in the grave I had dug. Yes, I dug it myself, with my bare hands, my fingernails splitting, my palms bleeding, and I covered it with earth while it watched me with those terrible eyes, never crying, never protesting, only accepting with the patience of something that knew death was not the end but merely transformation. And then I buried Mercy beside it, still alive, still breathing, because Elias had lied. Of course he had lied. Creatures like Elias Wren do not honor bargains with those they consider property. He took them both, the vessel and the innocent, my corruption and my hope. He took them both and left me with nothing but the knowledge of my own failure and the sound of his laughter echoing through the darkness. Thomas Hale found me the next morning, sitting in the cellar beside the grave. He thought I had died with my children, that grief had stopped my heart. Perhaps it had. Perhaps everything since has been merely the mechanical persistence of a body whose soul already fled. He buried us together, the three of us, mother and children, thinking he showed mercy even in death. But mercy cannot reach us here. Mercy died with mercy, buried alive in cold earth, and what remains is only memory and horror, and the certainty that Elias Wren achieved his goal. He persists, he continues, he owns us still, even here, even in death, even in the grave where all debts should be forgiven and all accounts settled. If you find this, know that we tried to fight. Know that some battles cannot be won, only endured. Know that the price of mercy is sometimes higher than the cost of cruelty, and that good intentions pave roads that lead not to hell, but to something worse. A place where hell itself would be relief, where damnation would be mercy. His name was Elias Wren. Remember it. Remember what he did. Remember that monsters are not born but made, created not through supernatural power but through the absolute conviction that some human beings have the right to own others, to possess them, to consume them so completely that even death cannot break the chain. The note ended there, unsigned except for the name at the beginning, testimony to a horror that Mercer now understood in its entirety. Dinah had not died of natural causes. She had buried her children alive, one already dead in spirit, the other still struggling for breath, and then buried herself with them, choosing suffocation over continued existence in a world where Elias Wren's will had proven stronger than death itself. Thomas Hale had not killed them. He had merely failed to save them, and that failure had driven him to madness, to his obsessive counting of days that meant nothing, to his eventual flight from a house that had become a monument to the limits of compassion and the terrible consequences of trying to show mercy in a system designed to make mercy meaningless. Mercer carefully folded Dinah's note and placed it in his coat pocket alongside the other documents he had collected. He looked one last time around the empty farmhouse, at the tally marks climbing the walls, at the disturbed earth of the cellar visible through the open door, at the shadows that seemed to move with intention despite the steady lamplight. Then he walked out into the night, mounted his horse, and rode back to town with the weight of this knowledge pressing against his chest like a stone, like a curse, like a debt he could never repay. Behind him, in the darkness of the abandoned farm, something made a sound, soft, patient, utterly out of place. An infant cooing in the darkness. Two infants, perhaps, both dead more than 4 years, yet somehow, impossibly, still present, still waiting, still owned. 23 years passed before Jacob Mercer returned to Thornwood County. He had left in 1867 with his report unfinished, his duty abandoned, unable to bear the weight of what he had discovered. He had moved west, then north, seeking distance from the horror that haunted his dreams. He had married, raised children, built a life carefully constructed to avoid anything that might remind him of those weeks in Alabama, of the courthouse cellar and the abandoned farm and the impossible sounds that had followed him like a shadow he could not outrun. But in 1890, at the age of 56, with his children grown and his wife recently deceased, Mercer found himself drawn back to the place where his understanding of the world had been forever shattered. He told himself it was closure he sought, a final confrontation with the past that would allow him to spend his remaining years in peace. But he knew in the deepest part of himself that he returned for the same reason. Men press on bruises or probe at wounds because some pains demand acknowledgement, because some horrors cannot be forgotten, only faced and faced again until they become part of the landscape of memory, permanent and unchanging. Thornwood County had changed. The old courthouse had been torn down in 1872, replaced by a newer structure of red brick and white trim that looked aggressively optimistic, determinedly modern, designed to announce that the past was past and the future would be different. The town itself had grown, new buildings crowding the streets, new families settling in the fertile bottomland where cotton once again grew, in fields tended by sharecroppers, who were technically free but economically bound as tightly as their grandparents had been under slavery. The Thomas Hale farm, however, remained as Mercer had left it. The county had tried to sell it multiple times, but no buyer could be found. Locals spoke of it as cursed, a place where livestock sickened and crops failed, where men who ventured too close reported hearing sounds that made their skin crawl and their faith falter. It stood abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and sweet gum saplings, a monument to nothing and a warning against something no one could quite articulate. Mercer approached it on a November afternoon when the light was thin and gray, when the air smelled of approaching rain and decaying leaves. He was older now, his hair white, his joints stiff with rheumatism, but his mind remained sharp, his memory of that earlier visit intact in every detail. He carried with him the documents he had collected 23 years before, Dinah's note, Thomas Hale's letters, excerpts he had copied from Elias Wren's journal. He had kept them all these years, unable to destroy them, unable to forget. The farmhouse had deteriorated significantly. The roof had collapsed in several places. The walls leaned precariously. The front porch had rotted through entirely. But the tally marks were still visible on the interior walls, faded but legible, their message unchanged. 241 days counted with obsessive precision, ending in that final circled cluster. Mercer descended to the root cellar with the same lamp he had used decades before, its brass surface now tarnished green, its reservoir filled with fresh oil. The grave was still there, still open from his earlier excavation, but something had changed. The skeletons had been rearranged. Where before they had lain in natural positions, now they were articulated, deliberately posed with obvious intention. The two infant skeletons had been separated and positioned at opposite ends of the grave, as though pulled apart by some invisible force. Dinah's skeleton remained in the center, but her arms were now extended toward both children, reaching for them in a gesture of desperate maternal protection that death had frozen into permanence. And between them, scratched into the earthen floor of the grave, with what must have been a stick or bone, were words, "He keeps his promises." Mercer's blood ran cold. Who had done this? Who had entered this sealed cellar and rearranged bones that had lain undisturbed for nearly 3 decades? When? And why? He climbed back to the main floor and searched the house more carefully than before, looking for signs of recent occupation. In what had been the bedroom, he found evidence that someone had been living here recently, a bedroll still showing the impression of a body, a canteen half full of water, and most disturbing, a journal lying open on the windowsill. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content was sickeningly familiar. It was an account of coming to Thornwood County, of hearing the stories about the cursed farm, of feeling drawn to it by something the writer could not explain or resist. The entries were dated from the past month, October of 1890, and they documented a descent into obsession that mirrored Thomas Hale's own tragedy. "I came here looking for history," the first entry read, "but I found something else, something that watches, something that waits. I hear it at night, soft cooing sounds that come from beneath the floor. I know it's impossible. I know the dead don't make sounds, but I hear it anyway, and each night it grows louder, more insistent, more real." The subsequent entries detailed increasingly disturbing experiences, sounds in the walls, shadows that moved independently of light sources, and most troubling dreams in which the author spoke with Elias Wren, who explained with perfect clarity and terrible logic why ownership must be eternal, why some bonds cannot be broken even by death, why the experiment that began in 1863 could never truly end. He tells me, the journal read, that consciousness is will given form, and will sufficiently strong persists beyond physical death. He tells me that he prepared a vessel, established a claim, created an anchor that would allow him to continue existing after his body failed. He tells me the child was that anchor, and through the child he persists still, waiting for someone to understand, someone to acknowledge, someone to finally recognize the profound truth he proved through his experiment. I asked him, what truth? He smiled. I could feel him smiling, though I saw nothing, and said, that ownership is not a legal fiction, but an existential reality. That property once claimed absolutely cannot be unclaimed. That he owns Dinah and her children still, owns them in death as he owned them in life, owns them across decades and across the supposed barrier between living and dead. And he owns me now too. I feel it. From the moment I entered this house, from the instant I descended into that cellar and looked upon those bones, he extended his claim to include me. I am property now, as Dinah was property, as her children were property. I am owned. The final entry was dated 3 days prior to Mercer's arrival. The handwriting had deteriorated into something barely legible, the letters cramped and frantic. I tried to leave. I packed my things and walked to the road, fully intending to never return. But I made it only as far as the gate before something pulled me back. Not physical force, but something deeper, something that operates below the level of conscious thought. A compulsion, an obligation, an acknowledgement of ownership that has seeped into my bones and blood and will not be denied. Wren was right. Property once established is eternal. The 27 cents Thomas Hale paid meant nothing. The supposed freedom granted by emancipation meant nothing. Legal fictions cannot override the fundamental reality that some human beings have found ways to extend their dominion beyond law, beyond death, beyond anything we believed possible. I will go down to the cellar tonight. I will lie in the grave with Dinah and her children. I will add myself to his collection, his property, his proof. Because what choice do I have? What choice does property ever have except to submit to its owner's will? Mercer searched the rest of the house frantically, but found no sign of the journal's author. The bedroll was cold, the canteen's water stale. Whoever had written those entries had done so days before and then vanished, down to the cellar as they had promised, or simply away, fleeing finally from the compulsion that had brought them here. Mercer did not go back down to check. He had seen enough graves, enough evidence of Elias Wren's persistent influence. Instead, he took the journal and left the farmhouse, walking quickly despite his age and infirmity, desperate to reach the road, to put distance between himself and that place of concentrated horror. But at the gate he stopped, because carved into the wooden post, in letters that were fresh enough to still weep sap, were words that made his heart stutter in his chest. 27 cents, a price paid to establish claim. The debt compounds across time. Below it, in smaller letters, you carry the story. You are bound to it. You will return. Mercer ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the rough edges, the deliberate precision. Who had written this? When? For whom? For you, something seemed to whisper in his mind, not heard but felt, a thought that was simultaneously his and not his. You came back. You always come back. Everyone who touches this story becomes part of it. Everyone who knows what happened here adds themselves to his collection, to his proof, to his demonstration that ownership transcends death and time and all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about freedom and autonomy and the sanctity of the individual soul. Mercer stumbled away from the gate, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding irregularly. He made it to the road, to his rented buggy, and drove back to town with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the reins. That night, in his room at the boarding house, he spread out all the documents he had collected across both visits, Dinah's note, Hale's letters, Wren's journal excerpts, the unknown author's recent account, and tried to make sense of them, tried to find some pattern or meaning that might provide understanding if not comfort. What emerged was a picture of horror more profound than simple haunting or supernatural persistence. Elias Wren had not merely found a way to continue existing after death. He had created something worse, a mechanism of ongoing corruption, a trap that captured anyone who encountered his story and bound them to it, adding their testimony to his collection, their experiences to his proof, their souls to his property. Every person who learned what had happened, who documented it, who tried to understand it, became part of the demonstration. Thomas Hale, driven to madness by his attempt to show mercy. Jacob Mercer, haunted for decades by knowledge he could neither forget nor share. The unknown, author of the recent journal, compelled to return again and again until they finally surrendered to the cellar's darkness. And how many others across the years? How many curiosity seekers, historians, travelers who heard the stories and came to investigate, only to find themselves caught in Wren's carefully constructed web of ownership and claim. The documentation was the key, Mercer realized. Wren had understood that stories persist, that testimony accumulates, that each new account added weight and reality to what might otherwise be dismissed as superstition or madness. By creating conditions that would generate endless documentation, the horrifying birth, the impossible haunting, the abandoned farm that drew investigators like moths to flame, he had ensured his experiment would continue indefinitely, that each new generation would produce fresh evidence of his philosophy's truth. Property, once claimed, is eternal. Not because of supernatural power, but because human psychology demands explanation. An explanation requires investigation. An investigation creates involvement. And involvement becomes ownership of a different sort. The ownership of knowledge, of understanding, of complicity in something too terrible to dismiss, but too dangerous to fully acknowledge. Mercer understood, finally, what Elias Wren had truly achieved. Not the transfer of consciousness into an infant's body, not the literal persistence of self beyond death. Those were merely the horror story, the mythology, the supernatural explanation that masked something more insidious. What Wren had created was a self-perpetuating system of corruption, a narrative trap that captured minds and souls, not through magic but through the simple human need to understand, to document, to bear witness. Everyone who encountered his story became part of it, their testimony adding weight to his claims, their horror validating his philosophy, their inability to forget or escape, proving his assertion that ownership, once established through sufficient will and cruelty, transcends all conventional boundaries. The infants in the cellar were not vessels for Wren's consciousness. They were symbols, sacrifices, proof of concept. Their death and the manner of it, one corrupted before birth, one innocent but doomed, both owned absolutely by a man who had found a way to make his claims outlast his body, created a horror so profound that it demanded documentation, and that documentation became Wren's true immortality. He lives not in the cellar, but in the journals, in the letters, in the accounts, like this one, that perpetuate his name and his philosophy across generations. He lives in the minds of everyone who learns his story and cannot forget it, cannot dismiss it, cannot escape the terrible logic that suggests some human bonds are forged so deeply, some claims established so absolutely, that even death cannot break them. And by writing this, by adding my own testimony to the collected evidence of his experiment's success, I make myself part of his property, another piece of proof that his understanding was correct, that ownership transcends all conventional limits when pursued with sufficient intelligence and absolute conviction. This is the true horror. Not that evil persists, but that it recruits. Not that Elias Wren found a way to continue existing after death, but that he created conditions that would ensure others would perpetuate his existence through their attempts to understand and document what he had done. I am his property now, as surely as Dinah was, as surely as her children were, as surely as Thomas Hale became when he paid 27 cents thinking he purchased freedom, when he actually purchased only a different form of bondage. And you, reading this account, learning this story, trying to understand the mechanism of horror that transformed human cruelty into self-perpetuating corruption, what are you now? Free? Or merely the latest addition to Elias Wren's collection? Another mind captured, another soul owned, another piece of evidence that the terrible philosophy he articulated in 1863 was not madness but prophecy. History calls it mercy when a man pays to save a life. But mercy can rot, and in its decay grows something fouler than cruelty, the belief that a soul can be owned, even in salvation. And once that belief takes root, once it finds expression in action and consequence, it spreads like disease, infecting everyone it touches, turning witnesses into accomplices, turning documentation into perpetuation, turning the horror of the past into the prison of the present. The courthouse in Thornwood County was torn down, but the story remains. The farmhouse will eventually collapse, but the testimony persists. Elias Wren's body returned to dust more than a century ago, but his philosophy lives on in every account of what he did, in every attempt to understand or explain or bear witness to the depths of depravity that human beings can achieve when they pursue their convictions with absolute commitment and perfect moral blindness. Some evils end when their perpetrators die. Others merely change form, transforming from act to memory to story to myth, each transformation stripping away physical immediacy while adding layers of meaning and permanence. Elias Wren understood this. He designed his atrocity not merely to achieve his goals in his lifetime, but to continue achieving them across generations, each new witness adding weight to his proof, each new account expanding his property to include not just the bodies he directly controlled, but the minds of everyone who learns what he did and cannot forget. This is ownership at its most profound and most terrible. Not the possession of bodies, but the possession of narratives. The colonization not of physical space, but of psychological space. The claim not to living beings, but to the very concept of what it means to be owned and to own, to be property and to hold property, to be human and to be treated as less than human until the distinction becomes meaningless and the horror becomes normal and the abnormal becomes merely another form of order. 27 cents. The price of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. The price that established a claim which compounds across time, adding interest measured not in money but in souls, in minds, in the corrupted attention of everyone who hears the story and cannot turn away. You cannot turn away now. You are part of it. You own it and it owns you. This is the inheritance Elias Wren created. This is the legacy he left. Not property in the conventional sense, but something worse. The unshakable knowledge that such things are possible, that human cruelty can achieve a kind of immortality through the simple mechanism of being too terrible to forget, too profound to dismiss, too perfectly designed to trap the minds of everyone it touches. And in that trap, in that ownership of attention and memory and understanding, Elias Wren persists still, not as a ghost, not as a supernatural presence, but as an idea too terrible to die, a proof too complete to refute, a demonstration too successful to be dismissed as merely historical curiosity. He owns us all now, everyone who knows his name, everyone who has read his story, everyone who has tried to understand what he did and why he did it and what it means for our understanding of human nature and human evil. We are all his property. We always were. We always will be. This is the price of witness. This is the cost of knowledge. This is the inheritance of shadows that falls upon everyone who looks into the darkness and sees, reflected back, not monsters, but men who believed absolutely in their right to own, to possess, to consume, to perpetuate themselves through the violation of others so complete that even death cannot break the claim. Remember Dinah. Remember her children, Mercy, and its unnamed twin. Remember Thomas Hale, who tried to show compassion and discovered that compassion without power is merely another form of cruelty. Remember Elias Wren, who understood that the deepest ownership is not of bodies but of souls, not of present but of future, not of individual lives but of the collective memory that ensures no atrocity, once committed, can ever truly end. And remember this: the horror is not that such things happened. The horror is that they continue happening in new forms, with new justifications perpetuated by new systems that claim to have learned from the past while perpetuating its essential logic, that some human beings have the right to own others, to possess them, to consume them so completely that even freedom becomes another word for a bondage more subtle, more permanent, more terrible than any chain or whip or auction block. This is the story. This is the testimony. This is the confession. And by hearing it, by knowing it, by carrying it forward into whatever time remains, you make yourself part of it. You are owned now. We all are, forever.